Hello, welcome to another genetics tutorial theory session. In this session we're going to look at polyploidy. If you're watching in order, we already talked about large-scale structural changes in individual chromosomes. We talked about aneuploidy, where you may have one or two too many or too few chromosomes. Well, polyploidy, we're going to talk about changes in complete sets of chromosomes. But before we can do that, we need to get some terminology down and revisit some things you already know, but revisit the whole idea of ploidy, which sounds like a sort of a strange term. So, to start at a place where we know we're familiar, we've used the term diploid many times to describe somatic eukaryotic cells, right? So eukaryotic cells, I say, are inherently diploid, and 2n is usually the way algebraically, you guys know, we express diploid. The term ploid is related to the ploidy level here. In this case, the ploidy level is 2, diploid, right? Di means 2. So that's probably pretty straightforward. But remember that eukaryotes, all of whom are capable of a sexual life cycle, with rare exceptions, it also implies that in addition to the fact that their somatic cells tend to be diploid, it's not even always the case. There has to be an alternation of generation due to the sexual life cycle. So there's got to be some haploid phase, which we've discussed, and you guys know as N, right? One set of chromosomes there. Haploid, it doesn't really mean this, but I think of it as half-ploid, right? If the normal number is diploid, well, then half of that refers to one set, right? Now, I say the haploid phase is often represented by the gametes, but that's not always the case. And we can't really get into it here, but let's just say that certain fungi and lower plants, for example, live most of their life cycle in a haploid state, and they only have a very brief diploid state. So, regardless, all eukaryotes have a diploid and haploid phase alternating with one another. You guys may have heard the term alternation of generations is a hallmark, a necessity of a sexual life cycle. All right? Now, another term that often gets confused with haploid is monoploidy. Bacteria, for example, are naturally monoploid. And you guys can tell if diploid means two sets, monoploid means one set, right? Now, does that mean monoploidy and haploidy are the same? Well, we'll see in a second. But bacteria are monoploid because they have one copy of their genetic information. It's usually on one chromosome, although that's not that relevant to the ploidy level. But they don't have a sexual life cycle, right? They're got one copy, and that's all they're ever going to have, right? So there's not this alternation. So I say here that the terms monoploid and haploid, I've seen textbooks use them relatively interchangeably. And even though I'm humble, I have to say that this is not correct. So both situations seem to refer to an n number of chromosomes. In other words, one set, or in the case of bacteria, one chromosome. But haploidy really should be reserved for the n phase in a eukaryotic life cycle. Some books will say it as, well, a haploid really means the number of chromosomes in a gamete, and bacteria don't have gametes, right? But we have to be more careful because we just said that it's not always gametes that are the haploid phase of a eukaryotic sexual life cycle, right? So let's just put it this way. Now, if your professor says otherwise, I'm right. But if they say otherwise, certainly do what they say, or if your textbook says otherwise. But monoploid refers to prokaryotes that do not have alternation of generations with one set. Haploid refers to the one set phase in an alternation of generations eukaryotic situation. All right? So now that we've got that down, let's take it a little further. Now, if a diploid organism, meaning a eukaryote, when we say diploid, it doesn't mean they always are. It means inherently to have a sexual life cycle, you have to be diploid so that you can alternate the generations. If you were to lose a complete set of chromosomes in a stable fashion, then you would become monoploid, right? If that's just the way it was. It would mean no more sex, not for you, but for the organism. And this sometimes actually does happen. Now, you'd expect if this happened, I say here that that would be incompatible with life. That would be fatal. We can't just go losing a set of chromosomes. But I just wanted to mention there are species where they have evolved to tolerate this, at least partially. One of the things you may have heard of, and if you didn't, check this out, members of the order Hymenoptera of the phylum Arthropoda, which basically is the fancy way of saying bees, wasps, and ants. You know many of these are social insects, and it turns out that in many of these species, males are haploid. They develop from unfertilized eggs produced by the queen, and this is stuff you don't have to get into for me for this lecture, but I'm just giving you ideas, okay? And I say, notice we should refer to these males as haploid, because the whole species hasn't lost a set. They are not monoploid. They represent one aspect of a life cycle in which other members of the species, the females, are diploid. So I guess the best thing to say is this. In fact, I should write it down. This system that so many bees and wasps and things like that have is called diplohaploidy. That's the official name for this type of a situation where there's some organisms are haploid and some are diploid, but it's the same species, all right? And you may also be familiar with the term parthenogenesis, which refers to an unfertilized egg becoming just growing, and that's how these male bees come into being. Bees come into being. Okay, but so the idea is, without going nuts about this, there actually are eukaryotic species, very few of them, that have lost the ability to do sexual reproduction. And most people say, oh, they've become haploid. But really, if it's stable and that's the way it is, they should be considered monoploid. All right? Now, if at this point you're already saying, oh, come on. Polyploidy, really, we haven't begun talking about it yet. We're just trying to get the idea of this terminology and this ploidy concept, right? So far, we've only dealt with anything that had one set or two sets, and we're trying to be very fine about the terminology, because depending on your professor and your textbook, they may be very picky about it. But let's go on and talk about actual polyploidy. Yay, okay. Well, polyploidy, as you might suspect, poly means a lot, refers to a situation in which an organism have more than two complete sets of chromosomes. Diploid is two sets. That's all we know so far. Now we're saying, wow, we're going to have more than two whole sets, not just one extra here or there. Now, almost all natural polyploids are plants. And in many cases, these plants, it seems to be actually beneficial to them. They generally are larger and more robust, and I'll show you a picture in a moment. Higher animals, really, you don't see a lot of polyploidy around. There are a few exceptions. In lower animals, you see it. And part of the reason plants can tolerate this, it seems like it involves the ability of plants and lower animals that have it to reproduce asexually. Listen, while all eukaryotes in theory can do sexual reproduction, many of them can additionally do asexual reproduction, right? As we're going to see, a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times polyploidy sort of messes up sexual reproduction. So if you're going to be polyploid, in most cases you have to be able to do asexual reproduction, all right? So this is really fascinating. Most famous crop plants that you know about, you can read with me, wheat, bananas, strawberries, coffee, lots of others I could mention, are polyploid. Mostly naturally. Sometimes we've tinkered with them and made them polyploid. And these are obviously plants of economic importance. So polyploidy is really the rule in agriculture. Sometimes it happens spontaneously. Sometimes it happened over 10,000 years as humans were being farmers and pre-farmers and not really knowing what they were doing. And sometimes it's been a recent, very deliberate development. Okay? So here's a picture, just to give you a general idea. On the two sides over here, these are members of the genus Brassica, which is the mustard family. But a lot of things that we know as cabbage and even broccoli is in this family. Right now, don't worry about specifically what they are. But the idea is that if you take one species that's diploid and another species that's diploid and hybridize them to make a tetraploid, someone who has four complete sets of chromosomes, a polyploid. Look at the difference in this plant. It's just the leaves are larger, the flower's larger, it's more robust. I'm going to show you this picture again later, but for now just get the general idea that for plants this seems to be a good thing. And many, many plants are polyploid. Okay? Now here's a little bit of a less fortunate situation. As I wrote down here at the bottom, this is a human triploid karyotype. Now, you can't have a human triploid, and the way we got this is a lot of times fetuses that miscarry, spontaneously abort, are analyzed for their genetic characteristics because we want to know what caused this miscarriage. This is not probably the most common cause, but it is a cause. So this karyotype was taken from a embryo or fetus that was miscarried, and they analyzed it and they said, look, this explains it. This was a triploid individual. If you notice, check it out. There are 3 copies of every chromosome. We can go all the way down the line, and here's 3 of the sex chromosome pair. It should be 2, right? If you count them all up, this individual has 69 chromosomes. A human cannot tolerate that, guys. It's just incompatible with life due to dosage effects and other things. Now, this probably came about because 2 sperm fertilized an egg, which should never happen, and it almost never does, but every now and then it does. But I wanted to show you this just because it was the only good karyotype I could find, and since you know what human karyotypes are supposed to look like from the aneuploidy session, you can see here very clearly that, yeah, there's a whole extra set. So there's 2 ways of looking at this. Yes, there's 3 of each type, but that means there's 1 complete extra set. So it's 3N. And unfortunately, this fetus never was going to be able to develop into a person. It's wild. It's showing you that in humans, triploidy is totally inviable. Plants, this would be no problem whatsoever. Of course, it wouldn't be an abnormality. It would be the way things are. So, for example, a couple of terms we definitely want to get down. Autopolyploidy. Auto sort of means self, right? Well, in autopolyploidy, all the chromosome sets originate from the same ancestral species. I'll give you a great example. The cultivated banana, the banana you go buy in the store, it's triploid, 3N, just like that human karyotype we saw. But this is the normal way of things for bananas. Now, this accounts for the fact, and it's why bananas are good, one of the reasons, why there are few seeds present. Few, I mean, there aren't many, if any, seeds. You can see the little vestiges of seeds down at the bottom. Why? Why are there no seeds? Well, I told you that polyploidy messes up sexual reproduction, and seeds are sexual, what is a seed? But a little sexually produced embryo in a coat, right? Well, hopefully you'll understand why, but the presence of multiple sets of chromosomes that can all recognize each other during meiosis I leads to what I call chromosomal chaos. Now let's stop there for 1 second and make sure we understand. What I mean is, this is a little misleading. I say they can all recognize each other. No, of course, all the chromosomes can't recognize each other. But if we just go back and look at this, I know these are humans, but just to give you the idea, say this was the banana triploid karyotype. When meiosis time comes, what's supposed to happen? Well, 2 number 1s are supposed to recognize each other, and they'll separate. 1 gamete will have one gamete will have the other, right? Well, when there's 3 number 1s, they can all recognize each other. And sometimes 2 of them will end up in a gamete, and sometimes 1 will end up in another gamete. Sometimes all 3 end up in 1 gamete, and 0 end up in another gamete. It's a mess, okay? So when they can, what I mean when they can all recognize each other, all the members of 1 type can recognize each other. If it's a triploid, there's 3 members. If it's a tetraploid, there's 4 members. They could all recognize each other, leading to most gametes that are totally imbalanced. Especially the more chromosomes there are in an organism, the more likely it is that these gametes are a mess. They're aneuploid, meaning they're missing chromosomes or have extra chromosomes. And this leads to general sexual sterility, literal sterility. So Jerry Seinfeld once said, "Did you hear about the seedless watermelon?" What are they planting to get the seedless watermelon? I like Steinfeld, but clearly it's an interesting question. But they're not planting anything. We need to use asexual reproduction to propagate things that are sexually sterile. And plants, there are many ways of doing this. We don't have to get into, horticulture here, but just through cuttings and roots and things like that. So various methods of propagating these by asexual means are prominent in agriculture. All right? Now, it's probably clear why having an odd number, meaning like triploid 3N, of chromosome sets got to lead to meiotic problems, because it would be, no matter what you do, 2 is going to go one way and 1's going to go the other. But it turns out that tetraploids, autotetraploids, which are 4N, are also generally sterile for the same reason. Even though in theory, sometimes 2 could go one way and 2 could go the other way, if there's 50 chromosomes, that's not going to, the probability of getting an actual gamete that has 2 of each in it, very ridiculously low. So, again, autopolyploids in general tend to be sterile. All right. The cultivated potato that you probably eat many times is an example of an autotetraploid, and we have to propagate these asexually, right? So, some crops that are supposed to be polyploid, meaning that that's the way they are, but they're sexually sterile. Now, allopolyploidy, allo sort of comes from the word autopolyploidy, we said means self. Allo sort of means different or separate. So allopolyploids, yes, they have multiple chromosome sets, but these sets were originally derived from different original species. Related species, but different. Okay? Now, I know species aren't supposed to be able to hybridize, but in plants they do a lot. We can't talk about it that much now, but if anything, it's a weakness of the biological species concept. But here's a general idea of what we think happens, and in certain cases there's evidence that this is surely what happened. Related diploid species can hybridize to form a species which is a hybrid. It's got one haploid set from each parent. Now, generally, these are sterile because one set looks at the other and says, I don't know who you are, right? But there are certain mutational events that seem not to be as rare as you might think, which cause each set to double. And if each set doubles, we now have 2 complete sets from each of those original parents, if you want, creating a tetraploid, an allotetraploid. It's diploid from one, it's got the full diploid complement from the one original organism and the full diploid complement from another original organism, a grand total of 4. Now, in general, you guys, I hope this makes sense, an allotetraploid is sexually fertile because there are, in essence, 2 whole diploid genomes in the same cell, but they're ignoring each other. They can complete meiosis without ambiguity because each of them has one proper pair and one proper pair only. Chromosome number 1 only matches up with one from that set. It doesn't recognize the other set from that other parent. All right? The gametes are diploid, containing one haploid set from each of the original species. When 2 gametes that are diploid get together, you end up with a tetraploid, right? Now, common names aren't always the best thing, but hopefully maybe you guys have heard of a rutabaga. That's an example of an allotetraploid. And we're going to go back to this picture because all these things. Now, common names mess things up in science, guys. The general term cabbage is a very, it may be something you think you know what it is, but it's used to refer to a lot of plants. So these same ones we saw in the brassica in the mustard family. Brassica oleracea over here is what most people would call cabbage. It might not look like it there, but let's just say a lot of people call cabbage different things, and there's kale and there's red cabbage and all this other stuff. This Brassica rapa, which most people call a turnip, but it depends where you're from. The point is they're both diploid. When they are crossed to hybridize, we get this Brassica napus, which is what most people would call a rutabaga. It's tetraploid. We've already seen how it's more robust, right? But the point here more is that if you look at a rutabaga, you can clearly identify the chromosomes, one set coming from B rapa, one set coming from B oleracea. all right? So we clearly know that this tetraploid, this allotetraploid, came from a hybridization between these two other species, all right? Great. A couple other things we need to cover here. Some terminology, make sure we understand this, and also how does this happen, this creation of polyploids? Well, one thing I want to tell you guys is that sometimes instead of calling it tetraploid 4N, we'll use the terminology 4X. X is sort of the same idea as N, it means one set, but the idea is we want to emphasize that not all the chromosomes arose from the same set. It's not that they're all identical. In other words, an autotetraploid is definitely 4N. It's got 4 sets of chromosomes from the same original species. But when we start mixing and matching, 4N, some books will tell you is not technically wrong, but it's better to say 4X, to just say, yeah, there's 4 sets, but some are different. Another way some books do this is they characterize an allotetraploid as AABB, where A represents one original I actually made a tiny mistake here. A represents one original haploid set. I'm sorry about that. I wrote diploid here. A represents one original haploid set. So AA means you've got a full complement of diploidy from one parent. BB means you got a full complement of diploidy from the other parent. Whereas an autotetraploid would be AAAA, just 4 copies of a set from the original parent. Okay? So I'm saying that would be 4N. This whole thing, you'd be better off saying that it's 4X. But again, you got to listen to your professor and your book, because I've heard different people speak differently about this. Now, apparently, polyploids have arisen spontaneously in nature many, many times, judging from the amount of them that are out there. And we understand it rather well, although it's hard to prove how species got the way they are. But definitely chromosome doubling is one key aspect of this, right? So there's a couple of ideas about how this can happen, and it may happen in a variety of ways. One would be if mitosis occurs without cytokinesis, you would end up with a cell that, if it started out diploid, it would now be tetraploid, right? Because cytokinesis distributes the chromosomes. That's one way you could end up with a tetraploid cell. Another way would be if the reduction division in meiosis failed to reduce, you could have a diploid gamete, which could fertilize another gamete, increasing the ploidy level of the resulting organism, right? If we want to make a polyploid, we could do that too. We have a great drug called colchicine. And what colchicine does is it inhibits the formation of the mitotic spindle. So I had the artist make what I think is a really nice picture here, starting with a diploid cell, showing you how we can make it tetraploid using colchicine. Up here is normal mitosis, right? You guys know what happens. We've left out some of the phases, but you have 2n equals 4, right? 4 chromosomes, 2 pairs. They all line up at metaphase, and we take the sister chromatids apart from one another so that we end up with 2 identical daughter cells, identical to each other, and to the parent that are diploid, right? But if you throw colchicine into the mix, look, this is the same, but what happens here? The mitotic spindle can't form, so the double chromosomes are just sort of floating around. And even though in many cases the chromatids will separate, the chromosomes are not drawn to the poles and no cytokinesis occurs, so you end up with a new cell that's tetraploid. Now in this case, it's autotetraploid, right? So I wrote 4X. We could say 4N equals 8 in this case. It's just that in general, this already shows you the confusion that can arise. It's, in this case, perfectly okay to say 4N equals 8. Some books will just say if you're dealing with polyploids, just use X instead of N, but the idea is the same, right? So by inhibiting the mitotic spindle, we've made this happen. I said before in nature, mitosis without cytokinesis could allow this to happen. Well, we just forced that to happen with colchicine, right? Okay, so we've made a tetraploid cell. Is it viable or not? I can't tell you, but I can tell you in plants it usually is. Now, to finish this up, polyploidy, we've talked about monoploids, diploids, triploids, and tetraploids. In theory, you can have almost any number, I mean, ridiculous amounts of sets are not possible, but 6 and 8 are relatively common. So polyploidy is not limited to just 3 or 4 sets. And I'll just give you one example that's very well understood of a hexaploid crop plant. This is wheat. Now, there's actually a lot of types of wheat, but what most people call wheat, specifically the species Triticum aestivum, if you have to say it, if you're an agriculturalist, we'll call this bread wheat. But it's basically, wheat cereal, what people mean by wheat. Extremely important economically. I think it's the second most popular crop in terms of the amount of nutrition it gives to people in the world. And it turns out that wheat's hexaploid, and I'm calling it 6X. And the reason is because it's derived from 3 definite diploid ancestors. Now, the total chromosome number is 42, but that's arranged. Look, if it was diploid, right, we would say, well, yeah, there's a total of 42, and there's 2 sets of 21 each, right? This is arranged into 3 groups of 14, and each of those groups is a diploid set, all right? So when I say 3 groups of 14, that means n equals 7 here for each of the groups, all right? So 14 came from one ancestor, 14 came from another, and 14 came from a third. So by our terminology, I want to put everything together down here. Wheat is an allohexaploid, right? Meaning it's got 6 complete sets, but they were derived from different ancestral species. And we could call it AABBCC, where A is 1 haploid set where n equals 7. B also happens to equal 7, and C equals 7, but they came from, see, this isn't so strange because they were related species. So they each originally happened to have a diploid number of 14. But it's very clear, and we know where they came from, all right? So 14 came from one original parent. I say parent, but I mean ancestor. 14 came from another, and 14 came from another. Not all at once. Probably it was tetraploid, and then another set was added, and it became hexaploid. So a lot of ways you could look at it. If you look at wheat just as an organism, you would have to say the diploid number is 42, and the haploid number is 21, right? But looking at it another way, if you say that it's 6X, you're basically recognizing that the diploid number is 14 for the original chromosome pairs, and that there's 3 diploid sets of 14, right? So it sort of depends how you look at it, but it's important that you're able to integrate all these ideas and all this terminology, all right? And just to finish off, I had a really nice, pretty picture of wheat. It reminds me of a nice field on a summer day. Triticum aestivum, wheat, very commonly grown both in the United States and many other countries in the world. And if you've ever seen wheat, you know what that's what it looks like. All right, you guys, polyploidy. And I will talk to you, I will see you real soon in another genetics tutorial session.